Welcome once again. This time around, we're going into the women question or the woman question. You'll hear both phrasings. We're going to be looking at the origins of feminism, the question of suffrage, and the relationship between feminism and socialism, which is not always a nice and easily defined relationship, and often is fraught with a lot of problems. When we're going to look at this question of what women's roles are, and there are a lot of different theorists about women and what roles they play. Um, by the way, my background has very little to do with women's rights at all, or suffrage movements, or feminism, or anything. It's simply a Canaletto painting that was kind of something I wanted to deal with right now. Um, when we look at this, there are a number of things that are going to be part of the what is known as the woman question. The phrasing "the woman question" is something that we use a lot in philosophical circles and scholarly circles now, when dealing with were women's roles in society at any given point. But it specifically begins to become the phrasing used in the 18th century as part of the Enlightenment, and it affects the concepts about women's roles that you see in the Enlightenment and through the French Revolution into the 19th century, and the discussions that surround suffrage. And so that's where we want to begin. In the 18th century, there were a number of different responses to the woman's question. Um, and one of the key pieces that you need to understand when you're looking at this is there were lots of different roles that women played in the Enlightenment and in kind of philosophical discussions of the 18th century. One of the key places where you found women in the 18th century was as hostesses of the salons where the philosophes hung out. One of the more significant ones is Madame Geoffrin, who was the hostess of the salon that Voltaire was a part of. Diderot was a part of this. She was well known. Now, don't get me wrong, there was not just one hostess, there were multiple ones. And there were women who were hosting these salons, sometimes with very patient husbands who were actually paying for it all. That was certainly the case in Madame Geoffrin's case. There were aristocratic hostesses and there were more middle class ones, much like, or bourgeoisie more correctly, much like Madame Geoffrin. On the other side of the channel in England, you found hostesses, but they went a different direction. In England, the intellectual women became known as blue stockings. Now, blue stockings for many fashionable women was an insult. It was not a compliment. And the Queen of the Blues was the woman that you see here in the middle of the painting, and that is Elizabeth Montagu. And her circle of these educated women are all depicted here as the muses surrounding the god Apollo. Now, they were called the blue stockings because the men who hung out with them were so unfashionable that their stockings were old and had turned blue in color instead of being white because they were so out of fashion. But Elizabeth Montagu and those who hung out around her and even the next generations after her were going to be women who hung out with very intellectual men like Edmund Burke that we talked about last time. These blue stockings wrote. The salon hostesses in France rarely did. But the blue stockings in England did. Some of them were aristocratic women like Montague. Some were more middle class or gentry. But they wrote in the humanities and the sciences. They wrote commentaries on scripture. They wrote commentaries on Shakespeare. They wrote histories. They wrote scientific treatises. So they wrote a lot of different things to contribute to the discussion and to kind of go against this tide that argued that women didn't have the ability to reason. So, what were the positions on the question of women, and what do we really mean? The, the whole women question is about what the nature of women is a woman different from man? Is she the same as man? If she's different, how is she different? And what should her role be based on what the difference is and what the relationship is between male and female? And it circled around this question about whether or not women were inferior. And if it sounds like we're recycling some things from Aristotle and Plato, then it should, because we are. And Plato and Aristotle both are going to show back up. Now, the standard social position in both England and the continent put women in a legally and socially inferior position, at least to a point. And the to a point is in terms of social position, because women had a great deal of authority in social circumstances, much like Madame Geoffrin. They did not, however, own property in their own name if they were a married woman. Women could own property, don't get me wrong, but a woman could only own property if she were unmarried, um, and likely if her father or brothers were not involved in any way. Okay. If a woman got married, particularly in Britain, then her money was not her own. Nothing, in fact, she owned. There's a famous case in which a woman's purse is stolen, and it is not actually her purse. It's considered legally to be her husband's purse, which is a great PR campaign for women's rights. Okay. There was always a question about when you dealt with the restrictions placed on women that they couldn't participate politically, they could support candidates by funds if they had them at their disposal, but they can't vote and they can't hold property, and there are a lot of legal restrictions on what women can do. So, what do you do with women rulers? Maria Theresa has to fight wars to defend her throne. Catherine the Great, and also you get, in fact, Queen Victoria. Well, Victoria is a bad example because Victoria thinks women are inferior um, herself. The women rulers were kind of the outliers because they got there not through election, but by inheritance. And that made them this odd kind of thing to deal with. Um, there were many who argued for an inherent difference that made women inferior and that they were relegated to hearth and home, that they should only reach fulfillment when they were wives and mothers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is very much one of those who argues for this position. Uh, now, amongst the philosophers, there were lots of different positions. Rousseau is not technically a philosopher, he's more romantic, he's kind of an in-between figure, but he certainly supports kind of the traditional point of view. Others will go in different directions. Rene Descartes, who operates at the early portion of the Enlightenment in the late 17th century and early 18th century, is going to talk about the kind of idea of a Cartesian dualism, that reason is independent of the body. And from that argument that reason and the mind and the body are two separate things, that dualism, which is very much kind of Platonic in its origins, is going to come a whole kind of cadre of folks who don't support this concept of women and women being particularly different. It's best illustrated by Francois Poulenc de la Barre. He writes a 3-part series on the equality of the sexes, and there's 3 of them. I'm only giving you one title. And he argues that the mind has no sex, and that yes, their bodies are different, but the only differences reside in the body, not in the mind. And the mind is what matters. That's where reason is. That's where capacity is. And yes, there are some physical differences between men and women, but that's all it amounts to. It's not a mental difference. And he dismisses the fact that there should be any kind of legal difference between men and women. Guys like Philippe Poussin and Joseph Caffo and the Defense of the Fair Sex will kind of espouse very similar ideas, and all in kind of using Cartesian dualism, and that the mind is separate from the body kinds of arguments. And You also get Neoplatonic thought. Now, in some ways, Descartes is closer to real, actual Platonic thought than these guys are. And the Platonic thought guys are going to argue for what he calls gender, what is usually used, phrased as gender complementarity. And what this means is, yes, there are two different, right? There's different sexes. There's a male and there's a female, and they are different. And that's great, because we need both, and that they are complementary. They do different things, but you need both for society to function, and without them, society doesn't function. But all of those rules were rational for Neoplatonists. They were not ones that were irrational. It did not speak to women's basic inability to reason. We see some of these things in John Locke's ideas. Locke's going to argue for the education of women, that women must be educated. Otherwise, how can you have a citizen participating in any sort of Republican government, because, or democratic government of any sort, because then women cannot, you don't have you have half your citizenship uneducated, and that won't work. Denis Diderot, who's going to be one of the major scions of the Enlightenment in France, is going to argue for the differences, but doesn't believe in the superiority of men. Okay, he's going to reject the superiority of men. I know it says but superior of men, but it means rejection of superiority. Then there's a blended position, a position that's going to take part of Cartesian dualism and Neoplatonic thought, and is going to say there is no difference in the mind. There are differences in the body, but there's no differences in the mind. But we also should think that they're complementary. Antoine Leonard Thomas in 1770s is going to actually write all kind of a history of men and women across the ages, and try to debunk the idea that women should need to have irrational roles, or just be relegated away from kind of discussions of politics and other things. Now, the greatest one who's going to address the women question, really, though, is in fact going to be a woman, and it's going to be Mary Wollstonecraft, who we were going to read and ran out of some time. Wollstonecraft is usually given the term of very much the early feminist. Sometimes she's called the first feminist if they're discounting Christine de Pizan. Sorry, Aurora. There she is in her kind of quintessential portrait. Wollstonecraft comes from a rather difficult situation. She is the second child out of 7. She had a grandfather who did very, very well for himself. But her father was a spendthrift. At one point, he tries to invest all the profits from her grandfather's business to make himself into a gentleman farmer, and it doesn't work. And it's the first of several disasters financially. And eventually, at some points, her mother is working to, in fact, support the family, and then her father will get rid of it, will just spend all the profits. And because of the property laws in England, he can do that. Of the children, the only child who winds up with an education is one particular brother who will become a lawyer. But Wollstonecraft does learn to read and to write. She leaves home in 1780 to earn her own way through teaching and publishing. She writes a number of works, including Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, which shows very much the influence of John Locke's ideas about education. John Locke is actually going to argue in several different letters that not only do women need to be educated, but also kind of listing the subjects that they need to be educated on. And though those letters are really a century earlier, you can see a lot of that influence on Wollstonecraft's ideas about education. And she's arguing, obviously, against her own experience, that women do need to be educated, because she needed to be educated. And this is one of the great quotes from Locke about this, that the cure of those false byways, and which ought to have never taken root in the infant mind. Good habits, imperceptibly fixed, are far more preferable to the precepts of reason. And so, in other words, you've got to actually to educate your women so that you have a good citizenship. She's going to write some other works about the original stories of real life and some of her own experiences. What's going to bring her to a notoriety for the rest of the philosophes is what she's going to say about Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke's Reflections is not well received by the philosophic community, largely because he's arguing against the concept of natural rights, that rights are not going to be a product of struggle, as we've talked about. And Wollstonecraft is going to find that rather offensive, and she's going to write a couple of different things. She's going to write a vindication of the rights of man and a vindication of the rights of woman. And her vindication of the rights of women is going to be the one that's the most significant. She's going to have a number of problems with her love life. She has a disastrous relationship with Gilbert Imlay. Imlay is abusive to her. He is going to cheat on her with other women. He is going to steal funds from her, and she doesn't seem to be able to break out of this rather codependency relationship. She finally leaves him in 1796. She is not going to marry him. She'd actually been married a time before, and once again, the same kind of problems that had cropped up with her parents had come in. So she just lives with Imlay, but it's going to be a disastrous sort of relationship. Eventually, she takes up with William Godwin. Godwin is a much sounder man in character. But even though Goodwin is, quite frankly, much better to her and for her than Imlay was, she's been burned very heavily, and she, for a long time, will not marry Godwin, even though she is going to be living with him. Eventually, she will have children by him, the most notable of which is going to be a daughter named Mary, who will eventually grow up. She will grow up as Mary Godwin. And Wollstonecraft herself will actually eventually die of some complications of childbirth later on. When Mary's fairly young, she's going to be raised largely by her father. She will grow up and marry Percy Bysshe Shelley. Interestingly enough, she seems to have no trouble getting married, unlike her mother, and gets married fairly quickly, and is going to also be, of course, the writer of the novel Frankenstein. And now Wollstonecraft and her vindication on rights of the woman is going to be the most significant of her writings. And in this work, she talks a lot about a number of issues, some of which sound very, very familiar to our ears, and others of which are very much related to her own time. A couple of folks had commented on some long-windedness of a couple of authors. She is no exception. It's not a matter of male or female in the 18th century. They're all long-winded, okay? And she's in this book, she's not actually just talking about men. She fusses at the men, but make no mistake, she fusses at women a lot in this work. She is angry with women and about how they accept the treatment that they're getting, but she's also angry at them because of the way they behave and what consequences that has. She thinks that women were ill prepared for society and given false expectations about what society was going to be look like. They're not educated properly, and they come to depend too much on their bodies to get what they want, and that she does not approve of. This focus on using their bodies, how they dressed, how they acted, how they flirted, and how they were taught to flirt with their fans. I don't have a fan, but I'm acting like I do. Are going to be things that they use, this kind of coquettishness. And she said, at whatever levels of society you were taught to use your body as a woman, and that she finds offensive. You need to stop dressing in revealing ways. Now, what does she mean by revealing? Well, the late 18th century and early 19th century is going to have this whole fad of wetting down the petticoats. And if you wet down the petticoat, you can see through the skirt and see your legs. And this is why you're supposed to wear a slip. This is what the whole petticoat business was about, but that's not what they're doing. And it's a very fast method. It's very racy, and there's a lot of racy kind of dress in this period. And so she's fussing about that. So what are her goals in this? Not just to get women to stop using their bodies to get what they want, although she talks a lot about that. She also thinks that they need to cultivate their own education through skills, not just learning how to dance or how to paint like upper class women were taught, but be educated for a variety of careers, and that includes mathematics, which was rarely taught to women. They need that because that would make them fully human and then able to take their place in society and politics. They would be better wives and mothers if they would do this, much less good citizens. She also wants property rights for women. She spends a lot of time on that, and she's seen a lot of the abuses of the lack of those property rights for women in her own family and her own experiences. She's very much about that. It's one of the reasons why she resides a lot in France, is because she's angry at the property laws in England. But she also insists on women being more modest. That's part of not using your body to get your own way. She thinks marriage should be based on friendship and not just physical attraction. She thinks that way is harmful to marriage and society. And she's kind of, well, really one who's had a lot of that experience. She wanted more professions open to women and other things that she talks about. So in many ways, she's got a lot of the hallmarks of a modern feminist kind of writer, but she's also got this whole other strand where she's angry at women and she holds them responsible for what she sees to be errors in their behavior and how they're treating themselves. She certainly wants a full citizenship and political participation. She's actually rather disappointed that the women are not given the full rights in France, as part of the revolution, that they're not given full rights to vote and things of this nature. Now we're going to switch our attention to feminism. Now, feminism is a complicated sort of thing, and I've given you the next two illustrations as handouts. This is the wave illustration. And one of the things that you'll hear when you hear discussions of feminism is this question of the different sections of it. And so often the illustration that's given is the waves, that the first wave is suffrage in the 19th century until the vote comes in, at least in Britain and the United States, in 1920 in the United States, and 1918 and 1928 in Britain. And then the second wave is 1960s and ERA. And it's also another wave of suffrage because you've got some places like Switzerland and Sweden, which don't give women the right to vote until 1970. And then the third wave in the 1990s is all about this concept of the gender and of how we talk about women. And it's going to have a lot more about awareness of that it's not just about sex, it's about gender. And then the fourth wave is this kind of social media call out culture, and has some other pieces to it. And you see this wave issue that talks about how we're constructing gender in the 1990s, ERA, and radical feminism of the 1960s. And it's an interesting model, but it sort of leaves a lot of stuff out. And there's a number of scholars in recent years who are very dissatisfied with this particular one. I've been at a couple of different conferences where there's been several papers that have attacked this model as inadequate. It leaves out anything that happens between, say, 1920 and 1960, as if there's nothing happening in the questions of women's rights. It leaves out, for instance, one of the hallmark activists for civil rights in lots of different ways, and that's Eleanor Roosevelt. And to leave out Eleanor Roosevelt is seemingly kind of wrong. But it also leaves out some inconvenient pieces of feminism history. And people like Margaret Sanger, who is going to be an advocate for birth control, but she's also a believer in eugenics, okay, and the science of racism. But she falls in the 1920s and the 1930s, the early portion of the 20th century, and she's inconvenient. She doesn't fit the narrative. And so the wave model kind of leaves her out, but isn't really true to what happens in the course of the movement. Now, the second illustration that I've given you, and I'm going to have to hide my own picture for a moment, is going to be that of what I call the feminist approaches, or more the genealogy of feminism. And there's a bigger one, and I call it the genealogy on your handout. Is that feminism is a complex thing that morphs and changes over time. And it's easy to understand feminism in that first wave of suffrage. And that's probably where the wave is the most useful kind of illustration, is to see feminism at its kind of beginnings. But even in its beginnings, there are seeds of its conflicts with other ideologies that are going to be prominent in the 20th century and certainly in the 21st. There we go. Now, you've got the same chart on your handout. So I want to talk about this for a minute because this is really kind of critical. First wave feminism is about suffrage. Now, there are two different kinds of activists, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Difference between a suffrage and suffragette. And most women in this initial push see the vote as the key piece, but there are also already other issues about daycare for workers and issues about property rights. Those are also bound up in this. And the property rights, some of that's going to largely come before you get to, in fact, the vote. A lot of the opposition to the vote had to do with the idea that giving women, particularly married women, the right to vote was going to simply duplicate their husband's vote. And so, what was that going to give you in terms of voting? All right. Uh, there were lots of, in this first range, you'll see this, there are lots of other reform movements at this period. There's going to be economic reform movements. There's going to be socialism. There's going to be political reform movements of lots of different types. And some of those activists, including people who are advocating for the abolition of slavery, are all going to be mixed together. But once some of those other reform movements get their goals, well, then they don't always have as much in common with the and are still advocating with those women who are advocating for women's rights in various sundry forms. And particularly once women do get the vote, you start to see some real splits. And you'll see this, and you've got four different groups that I've given you: the liberal feminists, the social feminists, the radical feminists, and the post-structural feminists. Now, one of the key kind of arguments that comes in almost very quickly in is the argument between feminists who are going to be saying that the oppression of women is the problem, and those who are going to argue that no, economics is the problem, okay? And it's all about, we need social equality, and male female is not really the issue. It's kind of tangential to the issue, which is this social inequality and economic inequality. And so you get these socialists who are very working class focused, they're very anti-capitalist, and they're really not interested in your gender agenda. Don't say gender agenda a lot, and it'll come and start mixing up around in your mouth. But instead, they're focused instead on quality of life and income inequalities, and it's very much a socialist agenda. One of the things that was really fascinating about the election of 2016, and even the election of 2008, is that you saw competing wings of the Democratic base going after the nomination. You see Bernie Sanders, who's a lifelong socialist and is very clear about he's an independent. He's not a Democrat. He, for the longest time, he's not even registered as a Democrat. He's a socialist. And then you've got, over on this other side, you've got Hillary Clinton, who represents more the traditional radical feminist, who she's got some other things that she's going to talk about because she wants to try and get elected, but she's very much representative of these radical feminists of the 1960s who argue a lot with the socialists about what needs to be done. And you saw that in the debates between Clinton and Sanders, and you saw it in between the debates between quite frankly, Clinton and Obama in 2008. And it was a really fascinating sort of thing, but it's the most clear, I think, in 2016 because it felt like I was watching the arguments of the 19th century come to life in front of me, because these are the same arguments that were had, amongst activists of that period. Now, so you've got the socialists, and then you've got the radical feminists who are going to argue that gender is just a myth. It's just the gender is a construct. They're even going to go further than the Cartesian dualists who are going to say that, the mind has no sex, and to say that there is no such thing as this. It's all socially constructed, and we've made this tyranny of biology, and that we need to break that out down through technology, and we need to get completely rid of the family. And they attack all structures of government and economics as patriarchy, as patriarchal and giving power to men, and that's the basic problem. And if we just give equal rights to women and women are in power, which is often also part of this, then we'll see very much the key thing, everything, and be righted. Well, now we've talked about the radical feminists and the social feminists, but there's another one who are going to be the liberal feminists. And the liberal feminists are all about equity. They're not about women are superior to men and that there's no such thing as sex other than by biology. These women actually, these folks actually think that there is a difference between men and women. They believe that. But they also think they're more on the line of the Neoplatonists and the complementarians of the Enlightenment period, and they want equality. Don't get me wrong, they want complete political equality, economic equality, but they also see very, very different, there are differences in men and women. A lot more European feminists fall into this realm. There are some who are going to be in the gender construct realm, but not all of them are going to agree with that. They're going to be often more towards the liberal end of things, the liberal feminist end of things. And you've also got Camille Paglia, who's over in this realm, who's going to argue with a lot of the radical feminists now and those who want to um, use gender as a construct. And she's also going to argue with a lot of the fourth wave feminism and call out culture. She's like, of course, there's such a difference in and how you approach rape. She has some things to say that those who like to call things rape culture, she doesn't always agree with them, and she's very vocal in this. And now understand, she is not a traditionalist in a lot of ways. She is a lesbian. She's a Dionysian. She is a classical liberal, that she doesn't want government involved in most things. She doesn't think there should be any kind of laws really regulating sexual activity except for certain things. But she also is one who believes very firmly that there are in good and evil, and that there are people who do evil things, and evil is not just a product of bad circumstances, that there are people who set out to do harm. And she talks about the differences between predators and prey in a lot of her works. So she's kind of on a different span of things. And then you got these folks over on this other side who are going to be over here on this end. So we've talked social feminist, radical feminist, liberal feminist. But over here, you've got the post-structural feminists who say there's no one definition of what it means to be a woman. And they're going to reject the radical feminists who they don't like, no, there's actually other things here. They don't necessarily agree with the socialists or the liberal feminists. And actually, they think the idea of what the West says as women or is equality isn't necessarily true for every place. There's a lot of post-colonial activists in this group who say, what women's lives look like in other places that other than the West is a very different thing, and some of your arguments just don't work anywhere but in your little bubble. And you sometimes will see some African American feminists head more towards the post-structural feminists or towards the liberal feminists more than the radical feminists. So you see a lot of discussion here. Now, why do I go through this very, very long-winded talk about these very different groups? It's because sometimes when we use the word feminist, we use it to mean all of the above all at once, and we're not really specific about what we're talking about. And these are vastly different groups who often don't get along at all. They don't like each other. Sometimes they like each other less than they do people who are actively working against them in other ways. And so this is one of those key pieces when we look at feminism. Now we're going to walk through a couple of things about the various waves of feminism. The first forms of feminism, this is a term that's not coined until the 1890s, so the end of the 19th century. It's coined in a French journal that's writing about social reform and women's rights. The first major theorist who could be said to be a feminist besides Wollstonecraft is really Charles Fourier, who is going to be talking about some of this. He's actually going to write some things for various journals. He thinks that the extension of privileges to women is essential to progress. It's very much kind of a Whig argument. It's a very much a liberal, classical liberal argument for women's rights. Some people are not even certain with by the way, with the wave thing that there's 4 waves. Some say there's only 3. And the 4th wave is all about social media, and it's just about how you're transmitting your message. It's not that there's a different message than the 3rd wave. There's always, as I just showed you, different interpretations of what this word means and what you're trying to accomplish through it. There are differences in goals and allies and who you're working with, who you're willing to work with, and what kind of methodology you'll use. And there are a lot of scholars who are not careful, who really don't like the waves at all for the reasons I described. Now, some of those who are in that group that are more liberal feminists are sometimes what we call relational feminists. Relational feminists are going to use this Neoplatonic view of women, much like what we talked about a few minutes ago, that men and women are complementary. There are you need them both. They both need to have a voice in society. This is the idea that supports women be involved in a lot of social reform movements, even before they get the vote, because they're more in tune with certain aspects of society than men are. And you need both voices. You'll see this in the writings of women like Josephine Butler, who's a noted kind of female theorist. I hate to call her feminist because it's hard to put her in a particular camp. She's probably closer to the liberal feminists than anybody else. You also get individual feminism, even in the 19th century, by women like Emily Davies, who knows and works occasionally with Josephine Butler. She's going to found Girton College with Barbara Bodkin at Oxford, and there is this, excuse me, not at Oxford, at Cambridge. And this is going to be a women's college for women. Now, individual feminism tends to argue that women have a separate, not only are different from men, but also that they need to have a different experience, and they sometimes have a different experience away from men. And so they need individual development. We see John Stuart Mill, who's going to advocate in 1867 for giving women the right to vote. They're pushing through universal male suffrage in 1867, and he tries to put an addendum onto the bill and get women the right to vote in 1867 unsuccessfully. He's going to agitate very much for this, and he's going to see this. This is more the liberal wing, the liberal idea of individual rights for individual women. And he's going to write, along with his wife Harriet, he's going to write on the subjection of women, very much advocating for women to get full civil rights. He's also going to argue against what he called white slavery or wage slavery, which involved prostitution for the white slavery and basically keeping down people through income inequality. First wave is really, though, all about suffrage. The suffrage movement and feminism is very much the first wave. The first suggestion of women giving women the right to vote, although there are some ancient scholars who argue that Athens would have gotten there if the democracy had lasted probably 50 to 100 years more than it does. But the first modern suggestion is in the middle of the English Civil War. It's actually suggested about 1649. It doesn't go anywhere, but it is discussed. You see lots of movement beginning in the late 1700s. You get women like Abigail Adams who are saying, "Don't forget the ladies," and some of the things that you need to deal with here. The coverture law, and that Dr. War talked about in his talk for Phi Alpha Theta. A coverture law simply means that a woman was covered by the male head of the household that she was in. And you also see this in a lot. This covers everything up into the granting of suffrage in the United States and in Britain. French Revolution is going to have an impact and is going to radicalize a lot of women who wanted the suffrage because they come close in the French Revolution but just don't get there. And so you get a lot of frustration for women's advocates in this period. In 1848, we see the first kind of international meeting of women's suffrage. It's at Seneca Falls, New York. It's a convention. Here you're going to see the Declaration of Sentiment written, and I included a copy of this on Canvas for you to look at, if you will. And you'll see some similarities to Declaration of Rights of Women and Citizeness and other bills of rights that you see. And it's about the intents of what they feel like they need to achieve. Now, there were lots of different arguments for suffrage, and there were commonalities between movements. The female experience being different was one of the strongest ones that they used. They argued that subordination of women and oppression of women was an institutional injustice. That you needed to enhance women's voices if you were going to solve some of the social problems. That and the female experience, they blend together a lot. They needed to be able to curb men's influence on their lives, much like what you see in Wollstonecraft's story. There were lots of different places that granted women suffrage first, and I gave you one. In the United States, the first state to do that is Wyoming, but the first country internationally to give women the right to vote is actually in New Zealand in 1893. Now, generally speaking, the places that grant women suffrage first are places where you've got frontier. Frontier societies, women tend to do better. There is a greater acknowledgement of the complementarity of women and men's roles that you don't always see in urbanized industrial societies. It's a little harder to see that. But in a frontier society, you've got to have two people to survive. This is why you don't really see a whole lot of single heads of households. If one spouse dies, the other spouse always remarries. And sometimes you had children being raised in a household who were actually related to neither of the adults, because this one married this one and this one died. And so this one married again. And now this one died, and this one, now the second wife marries a second husband. And so you've got all of these children who have to be taken care of, and you have to deal with all the necessities of life. You also have to have established political frameworks that already have popular political participation. If you don't have men with the right to vote, getting women the right to vote is kind of a non-issue. You have to get the men the right to vote first, and then you start on the women. So this is one of the things where, if you're looking at gender measurements, you need to look at one that actually looks at both the men's experience and the women's experience, not just the women's, because looking at just the women is just like looking at just the men. It's not telling you the whole story. Often the other part that's going to create a women's suffrage is about some sort of service to the state, a national emergency. World War I is going to serve as the catalyst, and women who actually pitch in with the war effort, it's hard to argue that they aren't part of the national war effort after World War I, particularly in Great Britain, but also here in the United States. That in fact the First World War is going to be a lot of the troop raising that's going to go on in the United States is done by women. And there's a lot of advocacy for, just sign up and fight for your country, sorts of things that's going to be done. Even by odd groups like the United Daughters Confederacy is going to be recruiting for the United States Army, which is a really, really weird sentence to say. Now, the British suffrage movement is going to give us a number of different key pieces. And the 19th century had highlighted, like I mentioned, a lot of the property issues. The case of Millicent Garrett Fawcett, she's the woman whose purse is stolen, and it's this huge issue. And that her purse is stolen, but it's actually not legally her purse and her husband. It's her husband's purse, which is kind of embarrassing for him. But it's still going to take a little while to get there. It's going to be 1882 before you get the Great Married Women's Property Act, which gives women the right to hold property while married and earned money and keep it even if they're married. It's now, notice, we're almost a century away from Mary Wollstonecraft writing about this before we get this into law. The biggest issue was suffrage, because it was felt like if women had the right to vote, then they could, in fact, hold office and, in fact, advocate better for the issues that concerned them. Harriet Taylor Mill is going to write, as I mentioned, with her husband on the subjection of women, and she's going to be a very much an advocate for suffrage. The very first women's suffrage committee is formed in Manchester in 1866, right as they're talking about the second Great Reform Bill in Britain. And they're going to begin advocating that, no, you shouldn't just give the right to all the men to vote, you should give it to the women. And there were some small successes in the 1860s from these suffrage committees. And once again, on the local level, in some areas, you would get women the ability to vote on town council meeting issues, and some local referendums, they had the right to vote. It's just not on the national level. Getting it on the national level is the real trick, and that's the difficult one. The first National Suffrage Society is formed in 1888 after the Married Women's Property Act, because they didn't feel like it had gone far enough, and that gave them a better way to advocate. There were a lot of splits in the suffrage movement over whether or not married women really needed the right to vote, or was it just single women or widows who needed the right to vote? Because even some women who advocated for suffrage, even some of the suffragists, are going to argue that, your husband's vote is going to be the same as yours. So why do you need two votes in a household? It's kind of redundant. And giving you more weight because you're a married woman, and then he is a single person. Between 1889 and 1993, you see a lot of the formation of the women's franchise leagues, like the different kind of associations to try and advocate for suffrage. This particular one is critical because it begins in the home of the Pankhursts. Emmeline, Christabel, and Sylvia, who you very rarely hear about. These are not, they don't want any kind of moderation. They want full force. The Pankhursts are probably the most visible symbol of the suffrage movement in Britain. The Women's Political and Social Union, the WPSU, is formed in 1903 by the Pankhursts. There you are with this whole deeds, not words, that we need action, not just words, to get through to these people. Emmeline is the mom. She has three daughters, Christabel, Sylvia, and Adela, whom you hear even less about. Emmeline and Christabel are really, really committed to the cause. And even amongst people who believe women should have the right to vote, we're going to see a serious disagreement over what the real problem is and how you should go about getting it. And it leads to a catastrophic failure of this family unit over the issue of suffrage. Now, Emmeline and Christabel are suffragettes, not suffragists. Now, a suffragist believes that women or men should have the right to vote, okay, depending on the context of what you're talking about. And in this context, women should have the right to vote, okay? The suffragist wants to advocate for that change in lots of different ways. They're not willing to use violence. A suffragette will use violence. And in fact, they resort to it very quickly. Emmeline and Christabel are suffragettes. Adela disagrees. She doesn't think the violence is a good idea, and she actually is going to argue with her mother on several occasions. And Emmeline has no use for anybody who disagrees with her, and books her daughter a passage to Australia and ships her off, and they never talk to her again. Sylvia is going to actually begin working with the poor, and she's going to kind of go more socialist route, and she's going to see that uh, poverty is the problem, not so much women getting the right to vote. She's not against women getting the right to vote. She's really not. But she thinks that you need this kind of reform that deals with poverty more than you need to go try to attack the prime minister's carriage and try to burn it down. She disagrees. And once again, we see a catastrophic failure of the family unit. And Sylvia barely talks to her mother or her sister the rest of her life. By the way, the husband in this scenario dies fairly early. He does seem to be very much an advocate of women's suffrage and lots of other social reform causes. But I mention all of this with the Pankhurst because it kind of symbolizes the struggles and the splits within the movement. And it doesn't really brook a lot of give and take, that there are different methods to get to this end. By 1909, the suffragettes are taking center stage. They are getting arrested for various violent acts, and then they're going on hunger strikes while they're in jail. And the authorities get rather frustrated with this, and so they began doing what is known as force feeding them, and you can see that here. And this is when this barely begins. It's called Black Friday, and they start force feeding them. This is going to be a field day for the suffragettes propaganda campaign. And because really they're very frustrated, the authorities they're arresting these women for setting things on fire and chaining themselves to the prime minister's carriage and all kinds of things. And so they arrest these middle-class women, and then they won't eat. And they force feed them. This doesn't go well. This is outrageous for the public. And so in 1913 they passed the Cat and Mouse Act. That's like, okay, you go on a hunger strike, we'll release you when your health starts to get in danger, but we're going to rearrest you once you start eating again. Okay. And it's this kind of round robin that's just a disaster. And then the First World War comes. And many of the advocates for women's rights, including Emmeline and Christabel, decide to sign on for the First World War and advocating and supporting the war effort and helping that. And that actually gains them some allies. Sylvia disagrees. She's a pacifist, and this is another strike against her with her mother. On the United States side, the suffrage is going to be tied a lot with abolition, and very much all the way through the Civil War period. We get a lot of Bible class societies. Bible classes where missionaries societies were organized, but also lots of reform societies. Some were things like Jane Addams, the Whole House supporters. You'll get supporters for mental health reform like that done by Hi guys. I got kicked out of the recording, so I have no idea if it lost the first half of this or not. So I'm going to try and finish this, and hopefully I get a nice seamless recording. If not, I'll try again, and I really hope I don't have to. So we'll see. One of the things that we see in the American side of things is that you're going to see an American Equal Rights Amendment movement formed in 1866, and that's kind of making it official. But one of the things, and why I say 1866, what's making it official, is a split eventually that happens between the abolitionists and the suffragists. And in the American society, because with the creation of the Civil Rights Amendments, the Civil War Amendments that come after, 13, 14, 15, one frees the slaves, one gives them, we get guarantee of due process, and 14 makes them citizens, and then we get the right to vote. And the 15th Amendment is seen as a betrayal by the suffragists. You list everything in this, that you can't do it on the basis of religion, servitude, a former consistent of servitude. Blah, blah, blah. Where's women? Where's sex on there? That you couldn't deny women the right to vote, and they just get left out, which is going to make them very frustrated. That those 14th and 15th Amendments. Now, modern day advocates will often say that the 14th Amendment is what gives women. That's what we get the Equal Opportunity Act based under, is the enforcement of the 14th Amendment, and that it applies to people, not just businesses, which is what it's used for initially. And those many who there are going to be some of the women who oppose the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1960s and 70s are going to argue that, no, I've already got one. I've got the 14th Amendment, and this does it already, and I don't need this other amendment. Um, uh, do not tell a radical feminist this unless you really want to be there all day. But And you get two different groups that will form in the United States that are going to be advocating for suffrage: the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Both formed in 1869. Eventually, they will combine. And some of these women, you know their names, and you've probably seen their pictures. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Julia Ward Howe. You're also going to hear Alice Paul and several others in here who are all going to be part of this. Eventually, the National American Women's Suffrage Association is formed in 1890 that combines both of these two competing associations. The United States, what we see is a slow state-by-state suffrage. You can see this here. And notice what you see here is bit by bit. Women get the right to vote in various blue states first. And you get them having the green states, they could vote for president. Before then, they have full voting rights before 19th Amendment and before statehood. And that's where you see these Western states that they're there before they even are states. Okay. They've given women the right to vote in these frontier areas like Wyoming that I mentioned, and of course, Utah and Montana and Washington. But you also have these other places as well. But you'll notice so many of these places don't do it until you get the 19th Amendment. These are older areas, including places like Boston and Pennsylvania and Virginia, southern states. Now, New York does get there before the 19th Amendment, but New York's really kind of the only one. New York and Rhode Island are it for the original 13 colonies. The others are going to take a national amendment to make it happen. I love this one. This is Uncle Sam's newest baby girl, and you can see this is a suffrage cartoon where you're getting all of the various different places where they can begin to vote. Wyoming, who's the oldest there, Utah and Idaho and Colorado and Washington State. And these are the advocates who are helping make that possible. What was the driving force that made this, that helped suffrage get through? Well, some will argue that it's Alice Paul and her militancy on both sides of the Atlantic, and her willing to be a suffragette, to go on hunger strikes, to do whatever it took in terms of violent action to bring this to pass. And the protest march. There certainly, we are going to see the National Women's Party move created in 1916, which is going to advocate for women's rights issues in the 1916 election and really drive Woodrow Wilson quite up the wall. But you also get in around 1916 the formation of a lot of housewives and suffrage societies that weren't these national ones, but they were suffragists, not suffragettes. And they are like, well, of course I should have the right to vote. I'm an intelligent woman and I have a different perspective than my husband, and I should be able to bring that. And for the vote, they could agree with some of the more radical activists like Alice Paul, who wants more than just the vote. But a lot of the suffragists just wanted the vote. And in 1919, we'll get the passage of the 19th Amendment, and then it's ratified in 1920. So that's why you've been hearing 100th anniversary stuff about this pretty much constantly. Now, there are a lot of people who, as I mentioned, between the first and second wave, we get Margaret Sanger and her work on birth control, but also her very troubling ideas about race. We get Eleanor Roosevelt and her advocacy for women from 1920s to the 1960s. Famously, she works, there's Mrs. FR, helping out the forgotten woman in the middle of the Great Depression who's been forgotten, that she's all alone and she needs also help as well. But you also in the same period get the writings of, and before I leave Roosevelt, I should also mention she's also going to be advocating for African American civil rights, and most famously is going to resign from the Daughters of the American Revolution when the African American opera singer Marian Anderson is refused permission to sing in Constitution Hall in Philadelphia and said, no, this is for white performers only. Eleanor Roosevelt moves that concert to the foot of the Statue of Lincoln in Washington, D.C. And there's this grand picture of this African American singer. There she is, Marian Anderson, singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial with a much larger crowd. And it was a really black day for the Daughters of the American Revolution. Simone de Beauvoir is also going to write in the 1940s, in between the first and second wave. And she's going to write a book called The Second Sex, in which she is going to be the one who really argues that gender is a social construct, that sex is a social construct. And she talks about gender instead of sex, which is a real change in the language of the movement for feminists that you begin to hear in the 60s and 70s. There's Simone de Beauvoir. She is a feminist existentialist. She doesn't think that you're born women, that women are made, or they are made into something different than norm and then oppressed. And it's a really interesting argument that she makes in 49, because you can see what's happened with the Jews in Nazi Germany and how they're first made into other and then can be eradicated. And it's the same kind of discussion that she's going to use, that's used to oppress women, she's going to argue. You aren't born women, you become them, because there's no difference. And like I said, the waves are a real problematic kind of analogy, but they're still going to be used and you'll still hear them. Second wave is really considered to be part of the civil rights movement beginning in about 1963. And you'll see this is when you start hearing the equal pay for equal work as an egalitarian kind of motto. But they're really arguing more, not just for this, but for the Equal Rights Amendment. And there you see Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and some of this. Betty Friedan is actually, this lady right through here is Betty Friedan, not Gloria Steinem, who's going to be arguing, who writes a book in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique. And she's going to add to the language that the radical feminists used. She's going to talk about the idea of the problem which had no name, that she was dissatisfied with her life and she didn't know why she was dissatisfied, and that she needed more than home and hearth, more than home and family, and she needed to know more. Gloria Steinem in the 1960s is going to found Ms. Magazine, and we start to see this nomenclature instead of Miss or Mrs. and defining women by their marital status. We're going to see this kind of neutral pronoun, or neutral kind of term here. Um, and the Miss or Mrs. is less of an issue now than it was for a long period of time. But for them, marriage itself is part of the patriarchy. And for the most radical feminists, marriage is an institution which needs to be abolished because it's patriarchal, and is detrimental to women. And they begin to really use this terminology of gender in the Ms. magazine that Gloria Steinem. But there were also still splits over this. Not every the feminists argue for a lot of civil rights, but they don't always agree. African American women didn't always agree with them. Some did, some didn't. Um, there were splits over the source of oppression again with the socialists who wanted different kinds of reform and economic reform. Um, Not all of the feminists felt like they could cooperate with the African American civil rights or the American Indian movement or the Chicano rights movement. And so some of them did, some of them don't. And so once again, you see this argument about what's the problem and then how we should deal with it. And once again, if I've decided this is the problem and I follow this with religious like devotion, then it's hard to always cooperate with other groups that I don't agree with on what the source of the problem is. In the 1970s, Kate Millett, or Millett, you'll hear that both pronunciations, is going to write a book called Sexual Politics, in which she's going to argue that the personal is political, and really begins the discussion of identity politics. She writes this book in 1970. It's a really interesting book. She's got a really kind of funky brain in a lot of ways, and she's going to very much argue for an attack on men, as well as very anti-male, as well as kind of pro-feminist argument. And Millett is difficult because she's in and out of mental institutions most of her adult life. Her own family's kind of terrified of her. But she says that's because they oppose her radical ideas. And her sister says it's because they thought she was going to kill him. So kind of a different sort of person here that we're listening to. The third wave of feminism is going to be actually kind of an opposition to radical feminism. They don't agree with this. They still want, a lot of them still really want equal rights. They still want, and meaning, but they don't think that they need an amendment to do that. They think that we already have equal protection. Socialists are going to oppose this. We'll get Phyllis Schlafly, who's going to be the subject of a new series on Hulu, and I don't know how they're going to wind up portraying her. We'll see. But she wrote a book called A Choice, Not an Echo, that I'm not an echo of my husband. I made a choice to do this. And how dare you say that I am somehow less worthy because I don't agree with you? And she disagrees. And there's a lot of women who agreed with her and not with Gloria Steinem. Many of them argue that a lot of them say you're too narrow in your focus about what the problem is. Once again, we're arguing about what the source of the issue is. Camille Paglia in 1990 is going to argue that they have lost what words actually mean. She's actually arguing for a return to the Western canon of education and the great books approach, and not adding these multitude of other voices, which she doesn't think are necessarily always as good. She's not against adding women into the canon or African Americans into the canon of books that we read, but she also doesn't think you need to throw out Aristotle and Plato either. She argues the persistence of pagan culture. She's very Dionysian in her own thinking about sexuality, as I mentioned. And this argument, and I mentioned this in the last lecture, she's very much talking about this Western culture as this argument between Apollo and Dionysus, reason and passion, and that's fueling what's going on in literature. And you'll miss this if you don't study this. She also believes that there are biological differences between men and women, and she doesn't just mean anatomical. She means in terms of how they operate. And she says that if you look at any kind of history and any kind of literature, you see this. And you see this in culture, you see this in all kinds of places. And she sees that there are truths in sexual stereotypes. And this is what she's drawing from literature. She's a literature professor. And she's going to argue in her sexual persona that there are archetypes, um, Dionysus and Apollo, the femme fatale, and she argues for these. And she is not going to be very popular with some of the radical feminists. There she is in her younger days. She's much older now. She's continued to be a hot topic. She criticizes the concept of rape culture, and what she calls the loss of common sense, which is under her picture there. Recently, oddly enough, she had a lot of young women protesting her as speaking because they didn't want to hear what she had to say, and which is a really interesting idea considering that these are the same kinds of people who are radical feminists who have been protesting that a woman should have the right to be heard in the 1960s and 70s. So it's a really fascinating kind of debate. Third wave feminism of the 1980s and 90s sees a lot more of this division into our diverse antagonistic groups, Paglia being one of these groups. And we see the question, the gender and sexual identity movement, which is another piece of this that really gets moving in the 1990s, that wants to escape the tyranny of biology, is usually the phrase you'll hear, and that gender is completely socially constructed. And now what we see is the argument here is that it is not binary, okay? We see the discussion of I feminism here, individual feminism. Once again, we hear the echoes of liberal feminism, which is that far left one on your chart. That shows up in things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, oddly enough, where you've got this girl who's very feminine, who's fighting all the monsters and is certainly empowered and can do this all by herself, and is very much an individual feminist, but she's not actually. She's also got men around who are also as part of this. It's not inherently anti-male empowerment. Sometimes feminism, you get the same thing called lipstick feminism, or stiletto feminism is another chart phrase you hear that says, yes, I can be equal, but I can still be feminine. I still want to dress up in a dress and twirl around and have poofy hair or lipstick and get my nails done. And that doesn't make me any less worthy. I don't want to burn my bra. I don't want to go around with no makeup. I want to look like a traditional girl. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so what you see somewhat in the third wave is really fascinating, because you get part of the arguments of Phyllis Schlafly kind of merging with some of the arguments of the radical feminists. The radical feminists don't want to talk about this, and they don't always agree. Third wave feminists do not agree with second wave feminists. They argue a lot because, once again, they don't agree with about methodology or what the problem is. There's the lipstick feminism. The fourth wave feminism is maybe coming in around 2005. It's really difficult. There's a lot, because a lot of scholars are not happy with the wave model to begin with. Trying to identify something that's as fast moving as this fourth wave is very tricky. It has to do with social justice. It emphasizes more spirituality. It talks a lot about social media. There's a lot of call-out culture here, questions of identity categories, and there's a lot of identity politics bound in here. They want a more positive body image. You'll see that a lot of talk about that. They want to talk about a rape culture and changing the culture so that we're not rape is not acceptable, and that the way we talk is not tantamount to rape. And you'll hear this kind of phrasing. Lots of questions about language, and they redefine words and argue with the second wave and the third wave in the process. They want an inclusive of a variety of women's experience. And so the fourth wave has got lots of different moving pieces, and this is why it's really hard to qualify. And in this, you see these post-structural feminists who are like, you're 1970s radical feminists. You are not representative of everybody. You certainly aren't representing African American women. You're not representing these women in post-colonial situations. And so we need to change what you're dealing with because your terminology is not working here. Um, like I said, lots of different problems with the waves. Shifting timelines, it's not inclusive of all the significant elements or people or ideas. And the third and fourth wave are still kind of moving, so it's really difficult to figure out where they're fitting in the kind of the the span of Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas and this complementarity issues. You see those ideas kind of crop back up again. The idea of liberal feminism and whether or not it's the socialism is and inequality is the issue, whether it's patriarchy is the question, whether it's other things, whether your terminologies argue, there's lots of different arguments and lots of fluidity here. Certainly there's a lot of, in the fourth wave, you can see some issues where we seem to be reconnecting with questions about social justice, which brings us back to the social feminism and the socialist wing of things, which is one of the reasons why they find themselves in conflict with the advocates from the 1960s and 70s, this older wing of the radical feminists from the second wave who don't always agree with what they're doing. Like I said, this is some of what you heard in in the 2016 election. Is it all merely derivative of the initial idea? Um, uh, and one of the problems that you get into with some of this is how much of this is constructed out of American society and how much of this is constructed elsewhere. And some of the fourth wave gets really very narrowly into American culture and doesn't apply more globally. And which you can see more with both the first and second waves is a wider focus. And you even see it with the third wave than you see with the fourth. And that makes some differences. Lots of interesting questions about how we still deal with women in politics, about some of the problems, uh, some of the attacks on Elizabeth Warren's campaign, and about some things there as well. Well, folks, that's the end of where we're going with the feminism lecture. I haven't given you a conclusion to it because there's not always a good one. And really what I wanted to make certain that you can understand is that there's so many different groups who are going to use the term feminist in different ways. Um, some are going to simply mean equal pay for equal work. Some are going to mean a host of other agendas along with that. So it really depends on who's talking, when they're talking, and what they're talking about, and how they use this term. Good night, sleep tight, and I hope I'll see you on Thursday.